Somewhere on a battlefield in 9th century England, in the moments before a Viking line broke into a charge, a small group of men stood apart from the rest. No armor, foaming at the mouth, eyes fixed on nothing. The textbooks will tell you they were berserkers, the rage warriors of Norse legend, men said to feel no pain and no fear. And the thing that put them in that state, we were told, was a mushroom, the red and white toadstool of folklore. For 2 centuries, that was the answer. Then ancient DNA was extracted from their bones, and modern toxicology reopened the case. Almost every part of the story fell apart. The drug was not what we were told. The men were not who we were told. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you. They never actually disappeared. So what really turned ordinary men into monsters on demand? To understand what the evidence overturned, you first have to understand what the evidence was overturning. And that means going back to the source, to the body of medieval literature in which the berserker first appears as a recognizable figure. The Old Norse sagas were composed in Iceland and Norway between the 12th and 14th centuries, but they drew on oral traditions that ran centuries deeper. And they describe these men in language that is remarkably consistent across separate texts, written by separate authors in separate generations. The Ynglinga saga, compiled by the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson in the early 13th century, describes warriors who went into battle without armor, who were as strong as bears or wild bulls, who killed men with single blows, and whom neither fire nor iron could harm. Egil's saga, one of the most detailed surviving accounts, describes the grandfather of its hero as a man who became a berserker by night and could not be approached by his own household. And a 9th century poem composed in honor of King Harold Fairhair lists berserkers among the king's elite warriors, biting the rims of their shields before combat and howling like animals as they advanced. The word itself has been argued over for centuries. In Old Norse, it is a compound. The second element means shirt or coat. The first element is the puzzle. It may mean bear, marking the warrior as one who wore a bear skin, or it may mean bear, marking the warrior as one who fought without a shirt at all. Both readings have their defenders, and the saga record supports both, describing some berserkers in animal pelts and others stripped to the waist in defiance of the cold. What the word does not describe is a casual category. The berserker was a specific kind of warrior with a specific function, and that function was understood across the Viking world. Their place in that world was contradictory. On one hand, they were elite fighters, deployed as the personal guards of kings and the shock troops of major raids. On the other, they were feared and avoided, described as dangerous to live near, prone to attacking their neighbors during fits of rage, and frequently killed by their own communities once their usefulness in war had ended. Several saga episodes record berserkers being hunted down and executed in peacetime by ordinary farmers acting in self-defense. And here's the detail that should make you pause. The saga descriptions are too consistent across separate texts and too physiologically specific to be pure literary invention. The shaking, the foaming, the apparent immunity to wounds, the collapse and prolonged exhaustion that followed combat. These are not the embellishments of poets. They describe a physical state that something was inducing in a specific category of men, on demand, before battle. The state had a name, and for 1,000 years, the question was simple: what triggered it? The answer that settled into the textbooks across the 19th and 20th centuries arrived from an unlikely source. In the year 1784, a Swedish theologian and natural historian named Samuel Odman published a short paper proposing that the berserker rage was the result of consuming the fly agaric mushroom, the iconic red-capped, white-spotted toadstool that grows across the boreal forests of the northern hemisphere. But here is what almost no one mentions about the man who gave us that answer. Odman was not a pharmacologist. He had never tested the mushroom on a human subject. He had never examined a Viking-era skeleton, and he had never analyzed a single trace of chemical residue from a Norse archaeological site. What he had was an argument, a literary one and a comparative one, and it ran along two lines. The first was geographic and cultural. Odman pointed to the documented use of the fly agaric among the indigenous peoples of Siberia, where shamans of the Koryak, the Chukchi, and the Sami traditions consumed the mushroom for ritual trance and visionary states. He drew a line across the map, from the peoples of Siberia to the Norse peoples of Scandinavia, argued that the cultural distance between them was smaller than it appeared, and proposed that knowledge of the mushroom's effects could have traveled west into the Viking world, along the same trade routes that connected the two regions. The second line was pharmacological, in the loosest possible sense. Odman had read accounts of Siberian mushroom use describing dissociation, distorted perception, reduced sensitivity to pain. He matched these against the saga record of berserker behavior and concluded the fit was close enough to publish. The theory was elegant. It explained the rage. It explained the foaming. It explained the apparent immunity to wounds. It connected the Norse warrior to a wider Eurasian shamanic world, which appealed to the comparative mythology of the period. And it was easy to remember. A red and white mushroom with a dramatic visual signature, a warrior cult, a transformation into rage. The picture had narrative force, so for 2 centuries this became the accepted answer. Odman's hypothesis appeared in encyclopedias, in popular histories, in academic surveys of Norse culture, in school textbooks, in television documentaries, and eventually in the imagery of the fantasy literature and video games that drew on Viking material. Every modern depiction of a mushroom-eating rage warrior traces back to a single 18th century Swedish theologian who had reasoned by analogy from a culture 2,000 miles east of Norway and who never once tested his own claim. The theory survived for a simple reason. Nothing better replaced it, and the tools that could have tested it did not yet exist. It was, in the most literal sense, a guess that had hardened into fact through repetition. The accumulated weight of 2 centuries of citation gave the mushroom the appearance of established knowledge. The problem was the chemistry, and the chemistry had not arrived yet. Modern toxicology began to dismantle the mushroom theory in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and it did so by asking a question that Odman had never asked. What does the fly agaric actually do to a human body? The answer, when researchers compiled the clinical literature on accidental and deliberate poisonings across 2 centuries of medical case reports, did not match the saga record at all. The active compounds in the fly agaric are mescamol and abotenic acid. Both are powerful neurotoxins that act on the central nervous system, and the cluster of effects they produce is well documented. The dominant symptoms are sedation, nausea, vomiting, profuse sweating, a loss of muscle coordination, confusion, slurred speech, and in significant doses, unconsciousness. Let that detail settle. The mushroom is a depressant. It is not a stimulant. A man who had eaten the fly agaric in a quantity sufficient to alter his mental state would be far more likely to vomit on himself and fall asleep than to charge a fortified shield wall in the front rank of a Viking army. The drug that was supposed to create the most ferocious warrior on the battlefield does the opposite. It takes a man off his feet. And the second pillar of the theory broke down just as badly. The Siberian comparison had anchored Odman's argument for 200 years. But when researchers actually examined the ethnographic record of mushroom use among the Koryak, the Chukchi, and the Sami, they did not find what the theory needed them to find. They found a tradition of visionary trance, of dream interpretation, of communication with spirits. They did not find a tradition of combat enhancement. Not anywhere. The Siberian shamans who consumed the mushroom did so in stillness. They lay down in a tent or a yurt, often for hours, while attendants watched over their bodies. They did not pick up axes and charge into battle afterward. The cultural function of the mushroom was not merely unrelated to what the berserker required, it was the opposite of it. And the pharmacological problem became impossible to ignore once the two pictures were laid side by side. The saga record describes warriors who showed dramatically increased physical capacity, men who fought through wounds that would have stopped an ordinary fighter, men who maintained coordinated combat performance for the full length of an engagement, and who collapsed only after the battle had ended. The fly agaric does not produce that profile. It produces something closer to its inverse. Stillness instead of fury. Sleep instead of rage. Collapse before the fight rather than after it. So the elegant theory that had stood for 2 centuries described the wrong drug. It described a man who could not have fought at all. And once researchers accepted that, the question reshaped itself into something more useful. If it was not the mushroom, then what northern plant could turn an ordinary man into the thing the sagas described? By the early 2010s, they were looking elsewhere. The leading alternative that emerged from this work was a plant known in English as black henbane, and the case for it is strong enough that most researchers now treat it as the best available explanation, though it remains an interpretation rather than a closed verdict. Henbane grows wild across northern Europe, including throughout Scandinavia. It was known to the herbalists of the Norse era. Its active compounds are hyoscyamine and scopolamine, terpene alkaloids, the same chemical family that produces the effects of belladonna and datura, and they act on the human body in a way that is fundamentally different from the toxins of the fly agaric. Where the mushroom shuts the body down, henbane sets it on fire. The clinical profile of henbane poisoning is documented in modern toxicology cases, and the match to the saga record is close to exact. Walk through it. Henbane produces severe agitation rather than sedation. It produces vivid hallucinations, often with violent or paranoid content. It produces a dramatic dissociation from pain, which is one of its most consistent reported effects in poisoning cases. It produces a racing heart, dramatically elevated, and the hot, flushed skin that comes with it. It produces a distinctive symptom that appears again and again in the saga descriptions of berserkers entering their state, foaming or frothing at the mouth, caused by the suppression of the body's normal swallow reflex. And in the recovery phase, it produces a profound and prolonged exhaustion that can last for days, which matches exactly the post-battle collapse described in Eagle's saga and elsewhere in the literature. The fit was not approximate, it was item by item. Where the fly agaric produced sedation, henbane produced agitation. Where the fly agaric produced nausea and stillness, henbane produced violent activity and immunity to pain. Where the fly agaric produced no documented combat tradition anywhere in the world, henbane produced exactly the cluster of symptoms that Norse warriors had been described as displaying for 1,000 years. Consider what each side of that comparison actually means on a battlefield. A man on the mushroom is on the ground. A man on henbane is on his feet, heart pounding, skin burning, feeling no wound, seeing enemies that may or may not be there and frothing at the mouth as he advances. One of those men cannot fight. The other is the berserker the sagas described. The shaking before combat, the frothing, the apparent immunity to iron, the howling advance, and then, days later, the collapse so complete the warrior could not function. Every line of it has a match in the pharmacology of a single northern plant. Henbane fit. The mushroom did not. But a chemical match, however precise, is still only an argument on paper. The saga record describes the symptoms. The toxicology explains them. Neither one proves that any Viking ever actually used the plant. For that, you need something you can hold. And the question that followed was obvious. Was there any physical evidence left in the ground? The evidence arrived from the ground. In the year 1977, Danish archaeologists were excavating a Viking-era cemetery at Fjerkrat, a fortified, ring-shaped stronghold built during the reign of King Harald Bluetooth in the late 10th century. And they opened a burial that did not match the others around it. The grave belonged to a woman dated to roughly the year 980, and the goods buried with her marked her as a person of unusual status. She had been laid to rest in the body of a wagon, a treatment reserved for the highest-ranking individuals. She wore silver toe rings, an ornament unknown anywhere else in the Scandinavian record. She had been buried with a bronze bowl carried all the way from Central Asia, a metal wand of the kind associated in the sagas with ritual specialists, and a set of objects the excavators could not, at first, interpret. Among them was a small leather pouch, and inside the pouch were several hundred seeds. When those seeds were sent away for identification, they came back as black henbane. Stop and let that land for a moment. The plant that modern toxicology had pointed to, the only northern plant whose effects matched the berserker state item by item, was found deliberately collected, processed, sealed in a pouch, and buried with a woman whose every other possession marked her as a person who handled the sacred and the dangerous. This was no longer a chemical argument on paper. It was a physical object in the soil. The fear-cat woman has since been identified by most researchers as a vulva, a Norse seeress, a category of ritual specialist described in the old poetry. These were women who traveled between communities, performing ceremonies, interpreting visions, and administering the substances that altered the mental states of those who consumed them. And here was one of them, buried with a hidden store of the exact plant the science had been looking for. And the fear-cat burial was not the only find. Later excavations across Scandinavia have turned up henbane seeds again and again in contexts tied to warrior burials, to ritual deposits, and to high-status graves dating across the whole of the Viking Age. The plant was being grown, harvested, and curated within Norse society, and the places it appears are consistently ritual, never domestic. This was not a kitchen herb. It was a controlled substance, handled by specialists deployed for a specific purpose. Think about what that means. A man eating a mushroom he foraged himself the morning before a battle is acting alone. A man given a measured dose of a dangerous plant by a trained specialist is the output of a system. And the henbane points to a system. The plant was grown, the dose was prepared, the specialist was trained. The drug was never a personal choice, it was a tool. And the tool belonged to an institution that could produce, on command, a man capable of doing what ordinary men could not. The pharmacological question had been answered. The men themselves remained, and for most of the modern era, those men had been treated as a category apart from ordinary Norse society. A recurring theme in 19th and early 20th century scholarship was the suggestion that the berserkers were a distinct ethnic or tribal lineage, a separate population, perhaps descended from an older substrate of northern peoples, perhaps imported from elsewhere in the Viking trade network, but in any case biologically distinguishable from the farmers and fishermen around them. The berserker, in this reading, was not just culturally different, he was genetically other. This was a theory built, like Odman's mushroom, in the absence of the evidence needed to test it. And like the mushroom, it did not survive the arrival of that evidence. The study of ancient DNA from Viking remains accelerated dramatically through the 2010s, and it culminated in a landmark study published in the year 2020. An international team led by researchers at the University of Copenhagen sequenced the genomes of more than 400 individuals from burial sites across the Viking world, from Norway and Sweden to the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and the eastern rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine. The first finding overturned an old assumption all on its own. The Vikings were not a uniform Scandinavian population. The genetic record showed significant gene flow into Scandinavia from southern Europe, from the British Isles, and from the Asian steppe, producing a mixed society in which people of widely differing ancestries lived, fought, and were buried side by side. But the finding that mattered most concerned the warriors. When researchers examined the high-status warrior burials, including a number interpreted as berserkers, the men did not show the genetic signature the older theories had predicted. They were not outliers. They were not a separate ancestry cluster. They carried no markers of descent from some vanished tribe. They sat squarely inside the mainstream genetic distributions of Viking Age Norway and Sweden, indistinguishable at the level of ancestry from the farmers and the fishermen buried in the graves nearby. The implication was specific. The berserker was a local man. What set him apart from his neighbors was not his bloodline. It was the institution that had claimed him. The capacity for the berserker state was never in the genes. It was in the system that selected him, trained him, administered the henbane, and deployed him on command. And then the DNA did one more thing. Population studies drawing on tens of thousands of modern Scandinavian genomes have established direct continuity between the Viking Age population and the living one. The same Y chromosome lineages found in those warrior burials are present at high frequency in Norwegian men today. This is a statement about ancestry and nothing more. It is not a claim that anyone carries an inherited capacity for rage. But the men themselves did not vanish. The institution vanished. The men went home, returned to the battlefield. The foaming warrior, the figure stripped of armor in the front rank of a Viking line. The mushroom story, repeated for 2 centuries on the strength of a single untested guess, was wrong. The drug was henbane, grown and stored and administered by trained specialists, like the woman buried at Fierkat with hundreds of seeds in a leather pouch. And the men themselves were not a separate people, not a foreign elite, not a vanished tribe. They were ordinary Norwegian men, transformed by an institution that no longer exists, whose descendants live in the same valleys their ancestors raided from. So the real surprise of the berserker story was never the drug. It was the disappearance. And the fact that the disappearance never actually happened. The institution ended. The ritual ended. The men did not. The only thing that ever truly vanished was the system that made them.